Welcome back to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, your home for community radio, 103.5 FM and live stream on newhavenindependent.org. We got a fun segment coming up now. We're going to tell you a story that I found very inspiring. And then as usual, I guess for a reporter, I was even more inspired by the story behind the story. The story is about a blade of grass, a kind of grass I never knew before existed called fescue, and how this story got to be told in a new children's book by our guest today, Joseph LaPolambara, a political scientist who in his 90s has found a new calling as a children's book author. Joseph, welcome to the show. It's so nice to have you on WNHH-FM.
Well, I'm delighted. That story, to be frank, is over a half century old. It was one of the stories I typically told my three kids, especially when we were on a long trip to Maine, where our summer house is located.
That's right. Let me just clue in the listeners. So Joseph LaPolambara has a new book out. It's called Fescue, A Brave Blade. I read it. I loved it. I recommend it for you. It's a story about a single blade of grass. And I had to look this up. Fescue is a cold weather turf grass. It's hardy, including in cold weather. So it's got strength. And it has about the story about how fescue gets a co-conspirator. Because the truth is, Joseph's background's in politics, so he was onto a conspiracy here. And he found out about a conspiracy with this dandelion, about how this one blade of grass can grow taller than the blade usually grows by using a few maneuvers and see more of the world and aspire to more than he otherwise would have ever seen or known. It's a great story for kids of all ages. And as Joseph was just starting to tell us, the story, he first told the story on car trips to his children when they would go on summer vacations to Maine. One of his children was David. I believe he's joining us. David is now a professor of art at Ohio University. David helped make the story into a book with one of his students who did the illustrations with him. And that's how this book came to be. Joseph, did you write down the story now, or did David remember it from when you told it?
Well, David did remember it, but I typed it up over a half century back and sent it out, hoping it would be then published. Instead of getting the usual rejection, I got a letter from the editor who said she loved it. However, children were not then reading fantasies. The problem is that the fantasies I invented always had a message. And the message in fescue is you don't have to be like everybody else. You can be yourself. It's not easy. It takes hard work. So fescue does his hard work and grows as a result. And my children loved it. I hope everyone who reads this book does.
Well, I'm definitely going to be reading it to my grandkid. So you would tell the story to your kids. You wrote it down. Your kids remember. So there's dad driving in the car, and you had a fun story to tell him about this blade of grass and the dandelion who conspire to dream big. And you were just talking about the message. What was going through your mind about how you wanted to bring up your kids and how telling a story can help get a message across and help influence your children's development?
Well, we lived in North Haven then. They were obviously very young. And I was committed to the idea that my kids should not be, if they didn't want to, like everyone else. And I decided the way to do that was to think about grass. Fescue, Marion Blue, who is in the story, Kentucky Blue, they're all grasses. Crabby is crabgrass. And Dandy the lion is obviously dandelions. And They are all going to be just like everyone else when the man comes by with the wearing grass cover. And so, in order to avoid being like everyone else, Saskia has to learn to duck, like the dandelions learn to duck and grow taller. And he finally grows tall enough to see what the hell the world looks like, his world, and it's beautiful. And that is the moral of the story, namely that being different will lead you to discover how beautiful the world can be.
And of course, while you were telling this story and writing it down, you were forging a very successful career as a political scientist at Yale, where you were a professor and you remain an emeritus professor. And you wrote all sorts of books that won honors, got you national and international awards. And you wrote about, you specialized in Italian politics, which is its own, I'd love to talk to you about sometime, and politics within nations, political parties. What was different and what was the same about writing a story like this, which has a very important message, and writing academic works about political parties and nations and governments?
Well, I'm not sure about the academic side of this. I once had a student, the only freshman I have ever admitted to one of my seminars, and after he wrote his first paper, I decided to read some of it aloud in class and said, "It looks like pure fiction." And he said, "Isn't political science pure fiction?" Why did I admit this guy? Well, his first name was Dante. His second name, his surname was Paradiso. Dante Paradiso. An expert on Italy cannot keep a kid like that out of his class. I looked him up. I Googled him. He is now with the Department of State and overseas.
Mm, all right. David, are you on the air here? Are you available to chat, David LaPolambara?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I am. As I said, and we're talking now with Joseph LaPolambara, the author of a terrific new book that I recommend to everyone. And if we have time, we'll get back to the environmental aspect of it. Fescue, a Brave Blade, published by Hard Twin Press. So, David, we just heard about when you were growing up with your dad, you would hear this story driving in car rides to Maine. You're now an art professor, and you united with one of your students to publish this book. What do you remember about the story, and why was it important to you to bring this book to publication?
So we begged my dad growing up to. This wasn't the only sort of fantasy story that he invented on these long car rides, and these stories would often sort of elaborate and sort of grow in complexity with sort of additional chapters or complexity. And so this is the one that he finally put on paper. It was certainly before laptop computers, and so this was typed up on a typewriter. And I asked for a copy before I went off to college at Oberlin with the idea that maybe I would figure out how to illustrate this story. And even though I discovered pretty quickly that illustration maybe wasn't going to be my strong suit in art, I hung on to this, being sort of persistent and dedicated. And I'm pretty sure that when I broached the sort of collaboration between myself, my student, and my dad 2.5 years ago, that the copy that I had at the time was probably the only one that still existed. And so what a great thing to finally have this story illustrated and kind of put images to the imaginations that we had all sort of concocted over the many years of sort of hearing this story and thinking about it.
And David, what do you remember about hearing it? How old were you when you first heard it? And what were you thinking? What was your reaction when your dad told you the story?
Well, I think I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And I think the message resonated. I mean, so, at the time, both of my parents were, academics. And maybe it's not a coincidence that I ended up in art, that my brother ended up a commercial photographer, that my sister ended up in theater. And so maybe on a personal level, we dared to do something maybe a little bit less traditional.
Mhm.
When I went off to college, and I'm a college professor now, I think pers- parents of prospective students will ask a very common question: what can my kid do with art? Is this the best career path? Is this a path that will lead to success? And my parents never asked me any of those questions or sort of doubted the career path that I was choosing for myself. And so I think in a lot of ways, maybe the message wasn't completely explicit at the time, because I was 8 or 9 years old, but I think it resonated and kind of stuck with me. And so uh, a happy ending, right?
And then how did it come about after all these years that it's 2.5 years ago that you picked it back up, that you found the right student and you got it published? What was the genesis of that chapter in this story?
Right. So this was a student that I helped recruit to Ohio University, who actually grew up in the town I was living in before I came to Ohio University. And so I was familiar with her work. She, Callie Smith, is the illustrator. She is in the Honors Tutorial College at Ohio University. And one of the things that the HTC students have to do each semester is a tutorial with a professor. And she was in a class with me, or going to be in a class with me, and it indicated that she was interested in children's book illustration. So obviously a light bulb went
Oh,
off in my head, right? But before I broached the idea with my student, I went back to my dad, who was kind of amazed that I still had the book, first of all, and was completely enthusiastic and on board with this proposition. Understanding, of course, and I even told the student that if we're going to do this, it's probably going to be longer than a semester-long process of getting it all figured out and illustrated, and there's going to be a lot of back and forth and editing of images and deciding exactly where in the text the illustration should happen and what the illustration should exactly be. And so, in fact, yeah, about two and a half years since that first conversation, there you go. You're holding up the the centerfold, and it's funny. I mean, it's interesting at this point. I Callie's illustrations have become my memory of what this book always was, which I think is a sort of tribute to this collaboration. Where 1 + 1 + 1 can maybe equal more than 3. That you bring people together and you kind of forge a sort of communal, collaborative vision of what it's going to be, and so now the current illustrations will be my illustrations forevermore.
and I also just love how much you love your father and how much he loved
Yes,
you to care enough
yes.
that he was wanted to tell you a story that had this impact. But before we get too mushy, Joseph, what was your reaction 2.5 years ago when your son all of a sudden says, "Hey, I still got the story. I got the student. Let's do a book."
But my thing was in a state of shock. Um, David said that story, and there were many stories. And I did endow Fescue with an ability to reproduce himself like Dandy the lion. My kids accepted that without challenge. I'm sure they knew that by and large, blades of grass cannot reproduce themselves. On the other hand, the message was clear, namely, be different if that's what you want to do, and you will discover what Fescue did, namely that there are others like him. And that is really, was for me, very important.
And so, David, how did you find, who found the publisher? David, were you the one who found the publisher for the book?
Well, so we had a local publisher that was interested in the book, but we also wanted to expedite the publishing of this book. So one of the things that that we did was created our own publishing company. So
Okay.
this book is self-published, hand Twin Press. I don't know if this is the first and last book that Hand Twin Press will ever publish, but you know, we did all the research, and it is, you know, the book has got an ISBN number. It's currently for sale at the Little Professor bookstore in Athens, Ohio, trying to support local businesses as much as possible. It'll eventually be available on Amazon, but I think right now we're trying to figure out if we can find bookstores in Ohio, in New Haven.
Do you ever make it to New Haven?
Well, I think we're still trying to figure out if there are some bookstores in New Haven that
I'm
will.
positive there is. I'm positive
Yes.
that Book Trader will do an event, and I'm positive that we'd be happy to co-sponsor it, and I'm positive that people would show up.
Thank you for that, Paul.
We've done a bunch of book traders. They love local authors, and they have a great cross section of the Yale community and the rest of the New Haven community. It's the most wonderful space, and it's a great local bookstore. So that's my plug for you to. And I'd be happy, David, if you want to email me later how to get you in touch with the owner.
Absolutely, thank you.
How can our listeners get the book now? Because I do want people to read it.
So right now, for sure, they can get it by emailing. I will, gosh, let me see if I've got the email. Little Professor Bookstore in Athens, Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, they can look that up on the web. So
yes.
can I, before we leave, I wanted to ask Joseph a question. Joseph, I'm kind of in awe of everything you're still doing in your mid-90s. You're turning 96 in May. So what's the secret? Is it crossword puzzles, or is it fescue, the spirit of being different and following your muse?
Well, it really is Chicago.
You grew up in Chicago's Little Italy. I know that. Yeah.
I'm from that part of Chicago, but we learned when I was very young, among other things, that this country demands that people who are different are people and are owed respect. And that very basic truth is something I think, in addition to fescue and other stories, that my kids have picked up, and I hope my students over the decades have picked up.
Right. Well, I want to salute you. I want to say I'm so pleased that this book is out there after 50 years of being a secret that inspired a generation of your children to pursue their own paths. Now everybody else can share in the story, and as your son David said, it has a new interpretation through his student from a new set of eyes. So thank you for joining us today, Joseph LaPolambara. You've had many successful publications to your name over the years, and I hope Fescue, A Brave Blade is one. Little Professor Athens. That's the email address, littleprofessorathens@gmail.com. If you want to email to buy the book, or you can just look it up on the web, the Little Professor Bookstore in Athens, Ohio. But I have a hunch that it's going to be more widely available in New Haven before you know it. David LaPolambara, thank you for rescuing this manuscript for the public. And I'm very inspired by the way you not only listened to your parents, but loved them and honored them, which is one of the great gifts, one of the great commandments that our traditions have led down to us. I also want to thank Harry Droz, our station manager, who keeps WNHH humming and keeps us in so many platforms that none of us can really count how many different ways people see and hear this program.
Thank you very much.
All right. So thank you for joining us today on Dateline New Haven. And we're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free. from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us day and night here at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.